Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now if you're thinking about a used RTX 3080 in 2024 then there are a couple of things to consider. The first is how the price compares to AMD's 6800 XT, which offered similar performance at launch yet sounds like a slightly safer bet these days thanks to the generous 16 gigs of memory. Based on the last 10 eBay listings, a used 6800 XT costs just £10 more on average and will certainly help alleviate any VRAM anxiety at higher resolutions. There's also the matter of frame gen support, or lack thereof, which I found to be a welcome feature on newer 40 series cards, but not a must-have one. Of course, if you do manage to find a 4070 for the same price as a 3080, then I'd certainly go for the latest, more feature-rich and less power-hungry option. That said, I've seen some pretty tempting 3080 deals lately, including this one from Amazon Warehouse Deals. Ripped box aside, this Palette Game Rock OC edition was still in the original untampered packaging, and for £369 it sounded like a decent buy. So then let's look at the 3080 in action 3.5 years after launch. I've paired it with an i9-14900K and 32GB of 6400MHz CL32 DDR5. Please try to ignore the high CPU temperatures. I made the mistake of thinking my old air cooler could handle this chip. Surprisingly, it didn't throttle, but we did get up to and over 90 degrees on occasion. I wanted to start with some older games today, games that either came out or were already out around the time that the 3080 launched, and if we look at Assassin's Creed Valhalla here with the highest preset, we'll see that we're hitting over 100 FPS at 1440p. It's important today to look at the allocated and utilised VRAM, which is on screen at the left hand side of course, because this will tell you more about how the VRAM limitation could potentially come into play at those higher settings and with modern games. Battlefield 5 also performed very well. This was one of the games where we saw our CPU temperature hit at least 90-95 degrees, but once again the 3080 is performing well at 1440p resolution with the Ultra preset. I also wanted to try Kingdom Come Deliverance because this was notoriously demanding and even featured a warning when you went up to the ultra high settings stating that it was reserved for future hardware. This game came out in 2018 and the 3080 of course came out in 2020, by which time at 1440p with these ultra high settings there were no problems running it, especially in pairing with a high-end CPU. Let's move on to our more modern releases. First up we have Baldur's Gate 3. I took a trip through the city here and as you can see our allocated VRAM sat at around 8GB whereas we were using around 6.5 at 1440p with the Ultra preset. The overall result was pretty good and that goes for the average 1% and 0.1% low. Usually I test Counter-Strike 2 at the lowest settings, but of course with the 3080 we can push things to high at 1440p, not necessarily the settings you want to go for in a competitive environment, but I wanted to show you that this one runs fine without any issues here. And I think it looks pretty good too. Elden Ring has a frame rate cap of 60 FPS by default and I tend to leave it at this of 1440p with the maximum preset and the maximum RT quality enabled. We saw 60 FPS with some pretty consistent percentile lows. There was the occasional dip and drop here or there, but nothing to worry about with this setup. Next up we have Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered. Now if we take a look at the allocated and utilised VRAM here, we can see we are getting up towards that 10 gigs and pretty quickly. The game runs very nicely however at 1440p with the very high preset and the very high ray tracing options enabled too. I do like to enable them where possible because some of the reflections do look pretty good and it's nice to see that despite these intensive settings we are still getting a good result. Now I know opinions on Starfield are pretty mixed, but I'm still having a blast playing this one, to be honest. Here, I was expecting a lot worse, but at 1440p with the high preset, we were seeing 65 FPS on average. I've tried to avoid any upscaling here. That includes DLSS or FSR2 unless absolutely necessary, which it will be with the later results, whereby I've enabled more intensive ray tracing features. Here in Starfield though, 65 on average with a 1% low of 51 and a 0.1% low of 32, and this is in and around Aquila, a pretty demanding city area. Next up we have The Last of Us 1440p with the Ultra preset here for 70 frames per second. To be honest, there's not that much difference between high and ultra settings in a lot of games, as I've showcased before in another video, but I did just want to show you that when we turn the settings right up, our VRAM is pretty much fully allocated and we are utilising 8.5 gigs with these settings. Not a game breaker of course, we're still seeing a decent average and our percentile figures remain pretty high too, but it does make you wonder about the future and what sort of toll they may take on the 3080's VRAM buffer. Palworld up next, a pretty popular title according to the Steam hardware survey, and one that I usually get a few stutters with. Here though, with the Epic preset 1440p with TAA, we were getting 99 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 57 and a 0.1% low of 46. Nothing to worry about here. We could potentially bump a few of the games tested today up to 4K of course, but it is entirely up to you. Perhaps the most intensive game I've tested today is Alan Wake 2, which with ray tracing off at the medium preset hit 66 FPS. This was a few more frames than we saw at the high preset, but the percentile lows were improved. If we take a look at the VRAM allocation and utilisation here, we can see we're getting up to around 8-9 gigabytes, but let's enable ray tracing and see what happens. Now with a card like the 3080, despite it being a few years old, you'd still expect to be able to turn things up a bit more. I think you'd still want to play at higher resolutions given the money you'd be spending on a used example, and I think at 1440p most of the time you can do that just fine. Some games though, like Alan Wake 2 with ray tracing, will absolutely decimate performance. Now The Witcher 3 at Ultra here will run like an absolute dream with all ray tracing effects off. As you can see, we're hitting at least 140 FPS, 143 on average, with pretty decent percentile lows. These figures will drop a bit in and around busier areas, especially if you're using a slightly weaker CPU, but let's enable ray tracing once again. Now in order to hit at least 60 frames per second again, which I think you'd expect from a card like this at high resolutions, we do need to enable DLSS. Thankfully it's the quality preset here though, so it doesn't look too different from native resolution, at least not in my opinion, and we are seeing 75 FPS with a 1% low of 53 and a 0.1% low of 39. Now to be honest, the figures do speak for themselves in a lot of instances, and the results we're seeing today in my opinion are still decent. Cyberpunk 2077 is another good example of this. Despite how demanding it can be with the settings turned up, we're seeing at least 70 FPS with the Ultra preset at 1440p. Our 1% low was 56 and our 0.1% low was 35. The game looks absolutely fantastic here, but let's enable ray tracing once again with a little help from DLSS. I've used the quality preset once again in terms of DLSS here, and I've gone with the RT Ultra preset, and the game looks absolutely stunning to be fair. Now we could go with a few slightly less demanding ray tracing options. Of course we don't get the full effects of the lighting and reflections etc, but I think this makes for a pretty decent experience. We could perhaps be a little more aggressive with that DLSS preset. Maybe balanced would certainly help improve our frame rate a little bit. But the 3080 has still got what it takes to run this title with a decent frame rate and everything turned up. I'm going to avoid path tracing though, I think. Last but not least, we have Red Dead Redemption 2. 1440p with the ultra textures here, everything else turned up to high, and the geometry and grass LOD sliders set to their respective maximum. Even here, we're only using around 4 or 5 gigs of VRAM according to the MSI Afterburner overlay, and performance is very good. I think dropping those geometry and grass level of detail sliders would certainly help improve things a little bit, but all in all with our i9 and 3080 we're getting a very solid experience, and this is especially true when we're outside of more populated areas. So would I buy a 3080 in 2024? Well, if the price is right, I certainly would. It is worth noting that if you do have overlays enabled, then you are going to be looking at the VRAM utilization statistics, I think. If the price is very similar now, even just a slightly bit more, I think the more sensible choice would be going with that AMD card. It does of course depend on what the market is like where you live. There's also a 12GB 3080. Not sure how much difference that makes, but from the prices I've seen in the UK, that's pretty similar cost-wise to a 4070, and at that point you may as well just go for one of those. I hope you've enjoyed today's look back at the 3080, perhaps a little sooner than I anticipated, to be honest. Let me know your thoughts down below, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching.